Hello, I'm now going to talk you through Chapter 6 of the GCSE Edexcel Biology 9 to 1 course. So Chapter 6 is plant structures and their functions. Now the first part of that is about photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is a key reaction that occurs in plants, and you really need to know this reaction. Basically, what plants can do is they can take water from the soil and they can combine that with carbon dioxide from the air, and they can convert that into glucose, which is a type of sugar, and into the waste gas oxygen. And what they're actually doing when they do this process is that they take sunlight energy and they turn that sunlight energy into chemical energy, into glucose. And the way that they do that is they trap the sunlight energy using chlorophyll, which is a green pigment which is contained within chloroplasts. Now often in an exam they might give you a diagram of a couple of plant cells, and one of the cells won't have any chloroplasts, but don't be fooled, because not all plant cells have chloroplasts. The ones found in roots, for instance, don't have chloroplasts because there's no sunlight there, obviously, because it's dark, and so they don't need chloroplasts because they can't do photosynthesis. So let's have a little look at what actually happens inside the plant to allow this to happen. So where does the water come from? Where does the carbon dioxide come in? So I'm going to draw a not very good plant. So this is my leaf. And then here under the ground, I have my roots. Okay, there we go. So very simplistic plant. So let's have a look first of all at how the water gets in. Okay, we want the water to come in from the soil down here, make its way up the stem and into the leaf, which is we know that the chlorophyll, the chloroplasts are here, and we know that the reaction is going to occur here. And so the water, when it comes in, it doesn't just go in straight through the roots here. There are tiny little hairs which stick out from the bottom. You can, tiny little ones. If you have a look at roots, you can just see them very fine, almost look a bit like cotton wool. And those cells are called root hair cells, and that's where the water comes in. And if we look at a root hair cell, it has this extension. I'm going to do another cell next to it here, and I'm going to draw a couple of cell walls just on my root hair cells. There's my cell wall going around the edge, and I'm going to draw a cell wall around this one as well. And so the water will enter directly into my root hair cell, okay, which is this cell here on the end. And this cell is function obviously is to get water and minerals into the plant, and so it has two features that allow it to be really good at doing that, at its job, at its function of pulling in water. The first one is that it has a large surface area. And the second one is that it has thin walls. So these are two features that root hair cells have to allow it to be really good at pulling water into the roots and into the plant. Now the large surface area, if this extension, this root hair section wasn't here, water would only be able to enter along this strip here. But actually by having this extension, it means that now water can enter all the way along here, all the way along here, all the way along here. And so the larger surface area means that there's more places for water to enter, which is exactly what we want. Now water can enter in two different ways. The first way is that water can enter by osmosis. And when it enters by osmosis, it goes into the cytoplasm of the cell. So the water is in the soil here, and the water will pass from the soil directly into the cytoplasm of the cell. And the definition of osmosis that you need to know is the movement of water from a high to a low concentration across a semi-permeable membrane. So the semi-permeable membrane is the cell membrane, and that means that the water only, if it's semi-permeable, it means only some things are allowed to pass through it. And so here we have water moving from a high to a low concentration. The water concentration is high here, lower inside the cell, and so it moves passively. It doesn't need energy, it just transfers from the soil into the cytoplasm of the root hair cell across the semi-permeable membrane, which is the cell membrane. Then that would pass from cell to cell over until it was then able to go up the stem. The other way that you need to know that water is able to come in is by diffusion. And when water moves in by diffusion, it actually moves into the cell wall of the root hair cell, and it passes from cell to cell along the cell walls. So this is water moving along the cell walls. Okay, and those of you that go on to do biology A level will find out that actually the very inside cell next to the xylem vessel, which is where the water is going to go up the stem, that has a waxy layer on it. And that means that when the water that's travelling along the cell wall comes into contact with that waxy layer, it's directed into the cytoplasm. And then the water then transfers into the xylem vessels in the stem through or via the cytoplasm. Okay, so the waxy strip directs the water into the cytoplasm. The other thing, obviously, that comes in through the roots are minerals. And what those minerals do, they are combined with that glucose we made in photosynthesis into all the different parts of the plant. So if you think about a plant, it's not just glucose. You know, it contains proteins, it's got DNA, it's got lipids, it's got petals, it's got flowers, it's got leaves, it's got roots, it's got stem, it's got bark, it's got all these different parts. And actually what the plant does is it uses the glucose made in photosynthesis as a starting point, and then it combines it with other minerals to turn it into different parts of the plants. So an obvious one, the ones that you've learned about before, is actually nitrate ions. And what you'll know is that nitrate ions are components of fertilizers, and they are used to make proteins. Okay, so nitrates are components of proteins. So the plant will use the glucose that's made in photosynthesis, it'll add a bit of nitrate ion, and it will convert that into a protein. And minerals have to be pumped into the cell. And the reason for that is that there's a higher concentration of most minerals inside the cytoplasm, inside the cell, than outside. And so the plant has to actively pump them across from a low to a high concentration. And in order to do that, that requires energy. And so if we looked around, or in this cell here, because it requires energy, we would find lots of mitochondria present in that cell. Any cell that does lots of things with energy, you always find lots of mitochondria present. And the process where we pump from low to high is called active transport. So mineral ions are actively transported from a low to high concentration into the cell using energy. So we've now got our water into our roots from the soil and our minerals into the plant, and they will pass up the stem, and we'll talk about what happens in the stem later. But we also now need to think about how this carbon dioxide, this gas, is actually getting into our plant. And so if you look on the bottom of leaves, actually what you find are tiny little holes in the leaf, and those holes are called stomata. One on its own is a stoma, several are stomata. So for instance here, this would be a stoma, 2 of them or 3 of them would be a stomata. And around the outside of the holes we've got these banana shaped cells which are called guard cells. And these guard cells are able to open the stomata or the stoma, and they're able to close the stoma. And so obviously during the day, so this would be a daylight stomata or stoma, and here what we want is we want carbon dioxide to be able to diffuse in through the stoma into the parts of the leaf for photosynthesis to occur. At night time though, we don't want them open because there's no light, and so we don't need to have carbon dioxide diffusing into the leaf through the stoma. And so what plants do is they shut them, and they shut them by causing water to flow out of them. Okay, so during night time, the guard cells lose water, and that means that they become flaccid, and that means that the stoma shuts. During the daylight or daylight hours, water flows in, so they gain water, and that makes them swell and causes the stoma to open. Now, plants have to have stomata because they want to be able to let carbon dioxide in and also to get rid of their waste oxygen. But as a consequence of that, the downside of that is that they do also lose water vapour through their stomata. And that's why at night time they shut them to try and prevent water being lost. So for the next part of photosynthesis and plants, you need to know what the structure of a leaf is like, so the inside of a leaf, and you need to know the functions or the roles of each of the different parts. So on the very top of the leaf, we have a waxy layer called the waxy cuticle, okay, and that allows water, etc., to run off the top of the leaf. Underneath that layer, we've got our first layer of cells, and these cells are just on the outside of the leaf, and we call these cells the upper epidermis. Okay. Underneath the epidermis layer, the upper epidermis, we have a series of very long, thin cells. And these cells are called Palisade cells. And for those of you that might have read Robinson Crusoe, in Robinson Crusoe, the fence was called a palisade. So palisade is another name for a fence, and these are meant to look a bit like a fence, hence the name. So these are Palisade cells. And these cells contain many chloroplasts. Okay, so loads and loads and loads of chloroplasts, more than other cells. And they have those chloroplasts because they then are the place where photosynthesis mainly occurs. And near the top of the cell of the leaf, so of course this is where the majority of the sunlight is going to be coming through. Underneath the Palisade cells, we have some more cells. Again, they have got chloroplasts, but not so many. And these cells are not packed together tightly at all. So a bit like this. And these are called Mesafill cells, and they join to make the spongy Mesafill layer. And they're spongy because in between these cells, here, you can see that we have air spaces, and so that's a key part of this layer. And the air spaces allow gases, carbon dioxide and oxygen, to move between these cells, okay, where we know some photosynthesis is going to occur, but also up to our Palisade cells, which is where the majority of photosynthesis is going to occur. So carbon dioxide can get there and oxygen can diffuse away. At the bottom of our leaf, we have our second epidermis layer, and this one is called the lower epidermis. And within our lower epidermis, we have, of course, those guard cells and the stoma that we talked about earlier. And so gases are able to move in and out through the stoma, which is open and closed by the guard cells, into those spongy Mesafill layer and those air spaces and diffuse up to those Palisade cells. Now, the fact that we've got gases moving in and out So we have carbon dioxide coming out primarily, and we have oxygen moving in. Because we are moving gases in opposing ways, we call this gaseous exchange. Gaseous exchange occurs in loads and loads of different places. The other place is the alveolus in the lungs, for instance, but here through the stoma, in between the guard cells, we have gaseous exchange of carbon dioxide and of oxygen.